Chapter 13. The Darkness and the Light. The house was empty and silent. Outside, the trees that covered the mountains of the Obersalzberg were bursting into life, and as Peter walked the grounds, carelessly tossing a ball that had once belonged to Blondie between his hands, he found it hard to imagine that there could be such serenity up here, while the world below, which had spent most of the 6 years being brutalized and torn asunder, was in the final throes of another destructive war. He had turned 16 a couple of months earlier, and had been allowed to exchange the uniform of the Hitlerjugend for the field grey fatigues of a junior soldier. Although whenever he asked to be assigned to a battalion, the Führer had brushed him aside and told him that he was too busy for such inconsequential appointments. More than half his life had been spent in the Berghof, and when he tried to think about the people he had known in Paris during his childhood, it was a struggle to even remember their names or faces. He had heard rumours about the things that were happening to Jews around Europe, and knew at last why his Aunt Beatrix had insisted that he should not talk about his friend when he came to live there. He wondered whether Ansel was still alive or dead, whether his mother had managed to sneak them both away to a safer place, whether D'Artagnan had gone with them. The thought of his dog made him fling the ball over the side of the mountain, and he watched as it soared through the air before disappearing into the heart of a clump of trees some distance away. Looking down at the road, he remembered the night he had first come here, frightened and lonely, while Beatrix and Ernst drove him to his new home, trying to convince him that he would be safe and happy there. He closed his eyes at the memory and shook his head, as if the recollection of what had happened to them and how he had betrayed them was something that could be forgotten. But he was starting to realize that it wasn't that simple. There were others too. Emma, the cook, who had shown him nothing but kindness through his early years at the Berghof, but whose insult at Eva Braun's party could not have gone unpunished by him. He had spoken to the Führer of what she had done, understated his role in the events that afternoon, exaggerated other things she had said in order to make her sound like a traitor, and a day later she'd been taken away by the soldiers without even enough time to pack a bag. Where they had taken her, he didn't know. She had wept as she was led towards the car, and he had last seen her sitting in the back seat with her head in her hands as she was driven away. Ange had gone soon afterwards, and of her own volition, only Herta had stayed. The Holzmans, too, had been forced to leave Berchtesgaden. The stationery shop that Katharina's father had run for so many years closed down and sold. He hadn't known anything about this until a visit to the town led him to the store, where the windows were boarded up and a sign on the front door stated that it would soon become a grocer's. When he asked the owner of the shop next door what had happened to them, she had looked at him without any fear in her eyes and shook her head. "You're the boy who lives up there, aren't you?" she asked, cocking her head in the direction of the mountains. "That's right, yes," he replied. "Then you're what happened to them," she said. He had been too ashamed to say anything and left without another word. The truth was that he was filled with regrets, but no one in whom he could confide. Despite the injury he had done her, he had hoped that Katharina would listen to him and let him apologize, and, if she could, allow him to talk about the life he had lived so far, the things he had done and seen, that perhaps he might even find some form of forgiveness. But the responsibility of that was gone now. 2 months earlier, when the Führer had stayed at the Berghof for the final time, he had seemed like a mere shadow of the man he had once been. Gone was the supreme confidence, the power to command, the absolute belief in his own destiny, and the destiny of his country. Instead, he had been paranoid and angry, trembling and muttering to himself as he wandered the hallways, the slightest noise enough to provoke his rage. On one occasion, he had all but destroyed everything in his office. On another, he had struck Peter with the back of his hand when the boy came to see whether he could bring him anything. He stayed up late into the night, mumbling under his breath, cursing his generals, cursing the British and the Americans, cursing everyone who he felt was responsible for his downfall. Everyone, that is, except himself. There had been no goodbyes between the two. A group of Schutzstaffel officers had simply arrived one morning and locked themselves in the study with the Führer for a long discussion. And then he had marched out, ranting and raging, before throwing himself into the back seat of his car, screaming at Kenka to take him away, to take him anywhere, to get him off this mountaintop once and for all. Eva had been forced to run after him as the car pulled out of the driveway, and the last Peter saw of her was her running down the mountain in its wake, waving her arms and shouting, her blue dress blowing in the wind as she disappeared beyond the curve of the hills. The soldiers disappeared too soon after, which left only Herta, and then one morning Peter discovered her packing her bags too. "Where will you go?" he asked, standing in the doorway of her room, and she turned to look at him, shrugging her shoulders. "Back to Vienna, I expect," she said. "My mother is still there. At least, I think she is. I don't know whether the trains are running, of course, but I'll find my way." "What will you tell her?" "Nothing. I will never speak of this place again, Peter. You would be wise to do the same. Leave now, before the armies arrive. You're still young. No one needs to know the terrible things you've done, that we've all done." He felt the words like a shot to his heart, and could scarcely believe the look of absolute conviction on her face as she condemned them both. Taking her by the arm as she passed him, he spoke in a whisper, remembering the first night he had met her 9 years before, when he had been mortified that she could see him naked in the bathtub. "Will there be any forgiveness, Herta?" he asked. "The newspapers, the things they're saying already. Will there be any forgiveness for me?" She carefully released his hand from her elbow. "Do you think I didn't know the plans that were being made up here on the mountaintop?" she said. "The things that were being discussed in the Führer's office? There will be no forgiveness for any of us." "But I was just a child," pleaded Peter. "I didn't know anything. I didn't understand." She shook her head and took his face in her hands. "Look at me, Peter," she said. "Look at me." He looked up, tears in his eyes. "Don't ever pretend that you didn't know what was going on here. You have eyes and you have ears, and you sat in that room on many occasions, taking notes. You heard it all. You saw it all. You knew it all. And you also know the things that you are responsible for." She hesitated, but it needed to be said. "The deaths you have on your conscience. But you're a young man still. You're only 16. You have many years ahead of you to come to terms with your complicity in these matters. Just don't ever tell yourself you didn't know." She released him now from her grip. "That would be the worst crime of all." She picked up her suitcase and made her way to the doorway. He watched her, framed in the sunlight that was bursting through the trees. "How will you get down?" he asked, calling after her, wishing she wouldn't leave him here alone. "There's no one else left. No car to take you." "I'll walk," she said, turning away and disappearing out of sight. The newspapers continued to be delivered, the local suppliers afraid to stop calling in case the Führer returned and took out his displeasure on them. There were some who believed that the war might still be won, and then there were those who were ready to face up to reality. In the town, Peter heard rumors that the Führer and Eva had moved into a secret bunker in Berlin, along with the most important members of the National Socialist Party, and were plotting their return, masterminding the manner in which they would emerge even stronger than before, with a certain plan for victory. And again, there were some who believed it and some who didn't, but the newspapers kept coming. Seeing the last soldiers preparing to leave Berchtesgaden, Peter approached them, asking what he should do and where he should go. "You're wearing a uniform, aren't you?" said one, looking him up and down. "Why don't you use it for once?" "Peter doesn't fight," said his fellow officer. "He just likes to dress up." And with that, they all started to laugh at him, and watching as they drove off, he felt that his humiliation was complete. Now the little boy who had been brought to the mountain in short trousers began to ascend it for the last time. He stayed there, uncertain what to do next. Reading the papers, he followed the arrival of the Allies into the heart of Germany, and wondered when the enemy would come for him. A few days before the end of the month, a plane flew overhead, a British Lancaster bomber, and dropped 2 bombs onto the side of the Obersalzberg, just missing the Berghof itself, but sending enough debris back to shatter most of the windows. Peter had been hiding inside the house, in the Führer's own study, and as the glass exploded all around him, hundreds of tiny shards flew towards his face, sending him hurtling to the floor, screaming in terror. Only when the sound of the planes had gone did he feel safe enough to stand up and make his way into the bathroom, where he was greeted by his bloodied countenance in the mirror. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to remove as much glass as possible. He feared that the scars would never go away. The last newspaper arrived on the 2nd of May, and the headline on the front page told him everything he needed to know. The Führer was dead. Goebbels was gone too, that awful skeleton man, along with his wife and children. Eva had bitten into a cyanide capsule. Hitler had put a gun to his head. The worst of it was that before the cyanide was taken, the Führer decided that it needed to be tested to ensure that it really worked. The last thing he wanted was for Eva to be left writhing in agony and captured by the enemy. He wanted her to have a swift release. And so he tried a capsule out on Blondie, and it worked, quickly and efficiently. Peter felt almost nothing as he read the newspaper. He stood outside the Berghof and looked across at the landscape that surrounded him. He glanced down towards Berchtesgaden and then towards Munich, remembering the train journey where he had first encountered the members of the Hitlerjugend. And finally, his eyes turned in the direction of Paris, the city of his birth, a place that he had all but disowned in his desire to be important. But he wasn't French anymore, he realized, nor was he German. He was nothing. He had no home, no family, and he deserved none. He wondered whether he could live there forever, hide away on the mountainside like a hermit, and live off whatever he found in the forests. Perhaps he would never need to see humans again. Let them all get on with their lives down there, he thought. Let them continue with their fighting and their warring and their shooting and their killing, and perhaps they would leave him out of it. He would never have to speak again. He would never have to explain himself. No one would ever look into his eyes and see the things he had done or recognize the person he'd become. For an afternoon, the idea seemed like a good one. And then the soldiers came. It was late in the afternoon of the 4th of May, and Peter was picking up stones from the gravel driveway, trying to dislodge a tin can from its perch. The silence of the Obersalzberg began to slowly be infiltrated by a deep sound that rose from the base of the mountain to where he stood. As it grew louder, he stared over the side to where a troop of soldiers were ascending, not wearing German uniforms, but American ones. They were coming for him. He thought of escaping into the forest, but there was no point in running, and nowhere to run to anyway. He was left with no choice. He would wait for them. He went back inside the house and sat in the living room, but as they came closer, he began to feel afraid and went out into the hallway in search of a hiding place. In the corner was a small closet, barely big enough to accommodate him, but he climbed inside and closed the door behind him. A little string hung from just above his head, and when he pulled it, a light came on, illuminating the space. There were only some old washcloths and dustpans in there, but something was poking into his back, and he reached round to see what it was. Pulling it out, he was surprised to find that a book had been carelessly thrown in, and he turned it round to look at the title, Emil and the Detectives. He pulled the light cord again, condemning himself to darkness. Voices filled the house now, and he could hear the boots of the soldiers as they made their way into the room. They were calling out to each other in a language he didn't understand, laughing and whooping with delight as they looked inside his bedroom, the Führer's room, the maids' rooms, inside what had once been his Aunt Beatrix's room. He heard bottles being opened, corks being popped, and then he heard 2 sets of boots making their way down the corridor towards him. "What's in here?" asked one of the soldiers in an American accent, and before Peter could reach out to hold it closed, the door to the cupboard swung open, letting in a burst of light that forced him to shut his eyes quickly. The soldiers let out a cry, and he heard their guns cocking as they pointed them at him. He cried out in return, and a moment later there were 4, 6, 10, a dozen, an entire company of men gathered around, pointing their guns at the boy hiding in the darkness. "Don't hurt me!" cried Peter, curling himself into a ball, covering his head with his hands, wishing for all the world that he could make himself so small that he would simply disappear into nothingness. "Please don't hurt me." And before he could speak again, an unknown number of hands reached into the darkness and pulled him back into the light.